I'm doing good, Professor. Thank you.
How are you?
Hi, how are you?
Good. You guys notice I prolonged the due date for your revision. I had a feeling I was going to have to do that. When I scheduled it, I wasn't sure where my 3-day weekend landed. So for my regular day job, I work what is called a 980. So I work 9 days and I get the 10th day off. So every other weekend, I get a 3-day weekend. And that's usually when I do all my grading. So when I created the syllabus, I was too lazy to go look at the calendar to see if it was landing on the 3-day weekend or not. So it was not on my 3-day weekend. So this weekend, I'll be able to catch up on all my grading.
You said this is for the research project paper revisions?
Yes.
Okay. So if I had to email it to you, because to turn it in, will you email it back to me or do I need to?
So I was thinking of, I'm kind of torn on how I'm going to work this out because of the way everything kind of worked out. And so I have found that in the past, when I have the Turnitin set up, I cannot like respond to you the typical way through the grading area in Canvas and then attach the paper with the edits for some reason. And then this time, since not everyone was able to use Turnitin, not everyone would see my comments in Turnitin. So I'm thinking of just doing my my comments in Microsoft Word and then emailing them each individually to you.
Sorry, that sounds like a lot of work for you.
Yes. I, in fact, am almost tempted to. So I kind of changed things up with the way I revise, help you guys learn APA. I gave you more more feedback on your first paper than I typically do. I usually wait till the second paper, but I went ahead and realized I think it makes more sense to do it on the first paper. So I think for this paper, unless I notice you gave me incomplete papers or something like that, I'm really just going to look at, you know, what you, your writing and your, what you, how you designed your projects and what you put in the introduction section. Because I gave you all that attention in the first paper, you should have the second one pretty much nailed, I'm assuming, unless something is glaring at me and like cussing at me almost. I mean, that's what it feels like as a teacher, like someone just said a cuss word at you. Didn't I just show you that? No. Then I'm just gonna kind of just pay attention to the main part for your research and go quicker through them.
Okay, sounds good. So if I have maybe personal questions of like, I didn't feel like this source was probably like my best, like, what do you think of it? I should probably contact you about like maybe specific things or.
Well, if the only requirement is if it's a peer-reviewed research paper.
Oh, okay. So as long as I was able to somehow connect it to my thing, because obviously they weren't like exactly what I'm doing. So I was like,
Oh yeah, and that's hard
kind
for,
of is along the same lines.
yeah,
Okay, I was
I
a little
get it.
concerned about that.
And that's hard for students that are just doing research for the first time, how to figure out how to connect papers that are not necessarily exactly the same research you're doing, but to relate their concepts to what you're doing. It's a little less straightforward. So you may pick up papers that are, they have to do with depression, but they didn't do a study just like yours. Well, how do you relate it to yours? And so on. Yeah, you're not going to find a paper that's exactly like yours.
No, I assume so much, but I just like in case you had an issue with them, I wasn't sure if okay.
Now, if you can say, well, these researchers found such and such while researching depression, but we expect to find this. It could be something different. In fact, you can say, well, you're doing it a different way, and although they found this, we think by researching it this way, this is what we find. So yeah,
Okay,
think of it as like kind of a conversation. Yeah.
Okay.
Professor,
Yeah.
I wonder if for because people had issues with turnitin.com, I know some professors who will create an additional assignment, give it no points, and then those people can turn in a Word document, and then they can still provide feedback like they normally would in a Canvas document. Would that be easier for you if we all just, I know it requires integrity of not submitting a new paper now that it's 2 weeks later, but I would assume that would make your life a little bit easier than having to email 35 people their papers.
It is easier for me to go through Canvas and just attach and then sit and give points. I think what I'll do is I'll create an extra space just so I can get the paper to you, and it'll go faster for me. I'll still put the grade and everything else under the proper area, but you'll find my comments in another place. I'll title it like, paper number 2 feedback or something like that. Yeah. All right. Great idea, Sabrina. Thank you.
I used to be a teacher too, so I get it.
Oh, okay. Great. Okay. So tonight is very short. It's just, it's actually a pretty short lecture. And and other than that, the homework assignment that goes with it is very easy. There's not a lot to it. Also, I changed 2 assignments, the very last 2 like chapter type assignments that you guys do on the weekends, to extra credit. So the last 2 ones, let me show you what they're called. Let's see.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Question also, based off of the feedback that we get from this rough draft, as you said, like you pretty much helped us or set us up for success with this, because now we have like obviously the bulk of the paper, and then we have to input all the information from the data once we're done with the study. But for the final draft, like I guess based off of the information that you give us from this rough draft, it doesn't seem like there's a lot of information that I'm going to have to add to the final draft, because it's already done, unless I completely like screwed up.
So here's the thing. If you did a very good job on your first paper and wrote it well, and I really don't have to give you much input, the second like 2B is almost like free points, because you won't really have to make much changes. So the second time, the final draft of the proposal it can almost be like free points, right? Because you won't have to make much changes if you did it right the first time. Where was I going with this? But hold on, my brain went blank. I am doing something new at work and it's like frying my brain. I have to think a lot.
All right. I also like asked this question as you were like going into the extra credit assignment, so I definitely got in your way of your line of thinking. So I apologize.
No. Oh, now I know what I was going to say. So after you do your revisions, that paper, it's heavily graded based on how well you follow my instructions from my comments in the first paper. I have had students who had a pretty good paper, and maybe I said 3 things, do this, this, and that. But they'll just turn it in and they might follow 2 things and not 1, or none of it and think I'm not looking. I don't know. Then I fail them on the second grade because they didn't follow my instructions. So
Right.
that's, yeah.
Well,
So you're right. You are pretty much done with your paper. For the final one, you're just adding the results from your research. Yeah. And you'll change like the verbiage, because when you're writing a research proposal, you're talking in future tense, like we will research this, we will be. Now, by the time you get to the final paper, the research is done and you have to talk about it as in past tense. So you have to change the verbs in there and change anything that you talked about in your method section that might have changed, because the most well-laid plans often fail. So, because sometimes you go, wait a minute, we thought we were gonna be able to get people to, participate this way, but no one did. So you had to change tactics. And so if something like that happened, change it in the method section. Yeah. All right. And then I also gave you the exact sentences to use for your statistics and little short videos to show you how to do the statistics, whether it's in SPSS or Excel, right? We're like total hand holding, right? By the time you get out of this class, you should be pros at this, hopefully. Let's fingers crossed. I mean, or close, maybe. I don't know. I can hope. I had a whole bunch of people waiting on me. Now I feel bad. I had that blocking it. Oh, that's what I was going to tell you. So the paper called Evaluating Research Methods in Popular Media, and the other paper called Is It Correlation or Is It an Experiment, are both extra credit now. You do not have to do them if you don't want. Okay. Let's get the show on the road before people fall asleep on me. Okay, let's see. Okay, here we go. So we're already on chapter 11. We have 14 chapters. We're almost there. Okay, Austin. Thanks for letting me know. So this chapter basically covers just more ways to design a research study, or different types of research studies that there are. There's the single case studies, quasi, and developmental research. So single case experimental designs is just like it sounds. It means you are looking at very few participants or only one person. You might think of these as, this is what a psychologist does every day. They are kind of doing single case experiments every time they have a new client in their office. They're taking notes, they're monitoring their changes, and so they're kind of a single case experiment. You might think of like Freud taking notes of his clients that are laid out on the couch, right? He was doing single case experimental designs, and he developed personality theory based on it. So this single case experimental designs evaluates experimental manipulation on a single research participant. So in the case of, a psychologist, he is, kind of experimenting on each of his clients. Everyone's different, and he's using some kind of therapy on each one of them, right? But you can do this in other instances too. Some research projects can only be done with one person at a time, whether it's because of the nature of the research or because they have limitations on the number of people they can collect or so on. And so basically, a single case design is looking at a person's behavior over time. And they usually will pick up or record the baseline behavior, say what is happening. Like maybe they want to test a new therapy for smoking cessation on a particular subject. Well, they will maybe test how much are they smoking before they try it out on them, right? That would be the baseline test. So they would find out how much are they smoking before they give them the therapy. And then they would apply the therapy and see if there's any improvement. And then they would go back the baseline, remove the therapy, and see if they return to baseline. There's two different kinds of single case designs. One that I just explained is called a reversal design, where they start at baseline, apply the therapy, and then go back to baseline. And then there's multiple baseline designs. I think I'm getting ahead of myself here. I just explained slide 4 completely, but you call these reversal designs an ABA design. So baseline, treatment, baseline. And they can get more complicated where you can have, and this is important to remember, that you can have more, baseline, treatment, baseline, treatment. So you can see it down here on the PowerPoint, where you can have not only an ABA design, you can have an ABAB design, where the treatment is applied again to see if, yes, was that the reason why they improved the first time? So it just helps to sort of double check, is it really working? It also looks to see if maybe the treatment is reversible, like can it be undone? Other things that can be tested this way are, maybe different. This is often used in school psychologists will use this. If you have a child that's having difficulties, you might try some kind of technique to help them. Say you have a kid that's got autism and they perseverate on something. And by perseverate, I mean, typically autistic children they find a liking to something they're very interested in, and that's the only thing they always want to do. I have an autistic kid and his perseveration is art. Now he's a student at UCI and he's majoring in fine arts, but the only thing he has always ever wanted to do is just draw, draw. And it was very hard to tear him away from it and get him to learn how to maybe spell his name, learn how to do math, etc. So a school psychologist might come in there and give the teacher suggestions for how they can reverse this behavior, right? Maybe they will say, well, give Johnny these new, maybe they come up with some new crayon that make different kinds of colors. And Johnny really likes these kinds of crayons, but you can promise the child, well, if he does his math for so much time afterwards, he can, use the crayons for a while, right? So you would apply the treatment to see if it will improve his ability to pay attention to his homework more, right? So you can see how this might be very helpful in some settings. And this is just sort of a a little graph to show what it might look like. So, you know, at the beginning here, if you're having homework problems, not really doing well on homework, but you apply the treatment, and now, you know, they get to have a reward if they do their homework well. And so during that reward, they might improve in their homework, right? And then if you remove it, now they no longer getting rewarded to do their homework, they fall back down, right? This shows, yes, maybe that treatment was working. Okay, so the introduction of manipulation at different points of time, it is where you might do it more often than just once. And this is to demonstrate that the observed change under multiple circumstances is helpful. So actually in multiple baseline design is where you might do this in different settings, maybe with different people, different circumstances to see if it's helpful. So in the case of little Johnny with autism, we might say, well, let's try the new crayon technique at home too. See if it works with in a different setting and with another person that is overseeing that child. And so that would be, you know, a baseline design is trying it out in all different circumstances to see how effective it is. Okay, so replications in single case designs. Traditional single case research presents results from each subject individually. So a powerful alternative to more traditional research designs are include these designs. It's useful for also applying some change technique in a natural environment. It's often used in schools, like I gave you with little Johnny, and procedures used with these kinds of designs can be sort of replicated with others. And these are really good when trying out new techniques. And then if you can find that they're helpful for one individual, you may try it out in other circumstances and other children too. So, okay, and then there's different ways of applying these baseline designs. Is depending on how long, maybe the treatment, you might extend the treatment to see if you can get it to stick. For example, here is an example using, you know, the number of cigarettes a person smokes. So maybe they smoke a high number of cigarettes at baseline, but if you give them the treatment for an extended period of time, how helpful is it? For how long? You know, here, the longer they applied the treatment, it seemed like at first they were maybe slipping up, but then they got better and then they stayed down at 0, right? Same here. But when they only gave it for a short period of time on this chart, you can see that it wasn't so helpful. So varying the length of treatment can also be helpful too, to see how long a treatment should be applied in different circumstances. Okay, and then there are quasi-experimental designs. These are conducted if you can't do certain things for a particular type of research. So maybe it's not possible to manipulate the independent variable, or maybe you're not able to use random assignment where you randomly select participants for different groups. These kinds of designs have issues with internal validity, but they can still provide very, very helpful information. So when we're thinking of these, we might think, or we think of selection differences. This has to do with random assignment. And these are biases that occur when participants who form the two groups are chosen from existing natural groups. So say I'm doing a research, and this is something you should always sort of keep in mind when you're selecting your participants. Maybe I'm taking students from a Psych 100 class to be part of my research. And I choose, maybe I say, well, I'm going to say all the students in the morning Psych 100 class will be in my control group, and all the students in the evening Psych 100 class will be in my experimental group. Well, because I didn't randomly assign them, there might be differences between those two groups. Maybe students in a morning group are younger because they don't have to work throughout the day, and so they can just devote their full time to class, right? Maybe students in an evening class are working students, and maybe they're older. That's why they're in an evening class, because they work during the day. So there could be sort of biases between these two groups, and it may affect the outcome of your study. So if you're able to do random assignment in your research, it's always very important to do so. Otherwise, you end up with selection differences. And where am I here? Yeah. Okay, so another type of quasi-experimental design is a one-group post-test only design, and they call these, a one-shot case study. And here, you do not have any kind of control or comparison group. If you think about statistics, like all of you, you have at least two groups you're testing, right? You have a control group and a comparison or experimental group. And so that sort of suggests that you probably have at least some makings of an experimental design because you're comparing something. Well, in quasi-experimental designs, they're not really experimental. A lot of times they lack that. And if you're thinking of the statistics for you guys, when you guys are looking at research design, you should be able to hear about a research design and start thinking of, well, what kind of statistics would that be? And if you recall, when you have a t-test, whether it's paired samples or independent samples, you are comparing two groups, right? Whether it's two separate groups of people or one group, but in two separate conditions, right? So that should always pop in your mind, a t-test. If you have more than two groups, then you are looking at an ANOVA because you have three or more groups, right? And when you're thinking of statistical analysis and you have groups, you should automatically think, wow, that's probably an experimental type of research because they're comparing groups. Just keep that in mind. But oops, did I lose my, oh, there it is. It disappeared. Keep that in mind when you are looking at research designs. You should be able to look at a design and know what kind of statistics would go with that. And that's what immediately pops in my mind when someone says, oh, I have a control group and an experimental group. Okay, but in this case, in a quasi-experimental design with a post-test only, you don't have that in place. So it's not a true experimental design. It's missing the comparison group. And so it really, you cannot give a conclusion really to say what actually caused the difference in a dependent variable if you don't have that in place. To kind of help strengthen a quasi-experimental design that does not have groups to compare, you might do a pre-test, post-test design, because that way then you can sort of measure baseline, what was going on before your experiment, and then whether or not afterwards the post-test changes, right? So you would compare the two. So that would help the post-test only designers by just adding a pre-test to the design. And here, this is still a t-test, but it's a dependent samples t or a paired samples t-test, right? Because it has the same group, just measuring them at two different times. So those are the two groups. Okay, so with quasi-experimental designs, like I was saying, there's threats to internal validity, whether or not your study is actually measuring what you think it's measuring. It also has issues with history effects. And this is where you have maybe a confounding variable or event that is occurring at the same time as your experimental manipulation. Um, History refers to any event that occurs between the first and second measurements if you're doing a pre-test, post-test, but it's not part of the manipulation, which may actually be causing a change, right? And then there's maturation effects. And these are changes that occur systematically over time. Basically, if you have a long period of time between your pre-test and your post-test, people change. They grow older if it's quite a long time, or people, become bored, hungrier, etc. There's different things that might be changing that's beyond your control, which could affect your outcomes. And then there's testing effects, and that's the sensitization by subjects on knowing that they're being tested. So if you do a pre-test and a post-test, the pre-test may tip them off as to what they are being, what the experiment is all about, which could cause them to change, right? We talked about that before. Those are called testing effects. It changes their behavior. And then there's instrument decay. And basically, this is just where, the maybe the wording in a survey becomes older. The topics are out of date. Um, you know, Maybe it's using antiquated language that people don't no longer do know or no longer use, and so it kind of doesn't make sense to some people who've never heard of that. So if you recall, we were um, talking about validity earlier in the semester, and there was different kinds, and one of them that we mentioned was face validity, and that's where I said where you just sort of face validity is just reading the face of the survey, right? You just sort of read it over. Does it sound right? Does it look right? Does it look like it's applicable to the thing that you think you're measuring? And that's where it applies here. You are just reading it over to making sure that the wording is up to date and current, right? To test for instrument decay. Then there's something else called, there's this anomaly called regression toward the mean. And this sort of happens whenever you don't have random sampling in your research. And it's where the two measures are basically not exactly correlated. It can occur when participants are selected because maybe they score really high or low on some variable. And then when they're tested again, their scores will tend to change in the direction of the population mean. So extremely high scores are likely to become lower and vice versa. And here's a little more about, so if your sample consists of maybe below population mean scores, the regression to the mean will make it appear that they move up on the other measure, when they get tested again. But if your sample consists of high scores, their mean will appear to move down to match the population mean. And it's just basically because you picked a non-random sample of people that are not exactly correlated, and then they'll tend to move naturally, whether they're exposed to your treatment or not, to the mean. Okay, so non-equivalent control group design. Someone is talking to me. Oh, okay, that's okay, Nina. Okay, this is where you have a separate control group, but participants in the two conditions are not exactly equivalent, and this is also because of lack of random assignment. The differences become a confounding variable that provides an alternative explanation for your results. And here, this is called selection differences or selection biases. And it usually happens when the participants who form your two groups in the experiment are chosen from existing natural groups, for example. Okay, so a non-equivalent control group post-test only design can be improved if you give a pretest, a non-equivalent control group pre-test, post-test test design can actually be one of the most useful quasi-experimental designs, because here now you have a control or a comparison to look at. And this actually does improve the internal validity. Oh, and then there's something called propensity score matching. And this is comparing groups over several variables. So it's where you have non-control group designs that lack random assignment, and groups may actually differ in important ways. But statistically speaking, you can actually start matching them based on different variables. So this is where having a demographic survey comes in handy, because you can look at certain variables on each one of them and match them to each other and then compare their scores. So if you have maybe you ask them personality type questions on a demographics survey, you might look to see if you have several matching people in a personality type. That might help you make a comparison on your dependent variable with that, or other variables, maybe their height or their weight or whatever it might be. That could help. So once you have them, then you combine them and you come up with what is called a propensity score. And this is just basically a combined score of matching multiple variables in an individual to test them on your dependent variable. All right, and then there's something called an interrupted time series design. This is a time series is a continuous sequence of observations on a population taken repeatedly instead of just once. You do it quite a few times, normally like at equal intervals over time. And then all of a sudden it's sort of interrupted by some kind of intervention at some known point in time. This is called like interrupted time series design, where you would sort of examine something over time before you interrupted with maybe, actually I can think of real life where this kind of happens, like, you have surprise moments. It's kind of doing that, but in research, and then testing the effects of it, because you want to see over a long period of time, what were they like before this surprise event happens, right? A control series design helps to improve an interrupted time series design by finding an appropriate control group to compare it to, basically. And here you have to find a similar population to compare them to. You can do this even at a later date to compare them later. And then there's developmental research designs. I think these are fun, but I never really got into it. I started to a little bit in the social services agency, and then I was moved to a different section because we have a children and family area. But here we have different methods for studying people as they age and mature, whether it's from birth to death. you can have different kinds of research in that. And there's different ways we do it. And one's a cross-sectional method. And here we're using independent groups at one spot in time. I'll explain a little bit more here in a minute. And then there's a longitudinal method, which takes much longer. It follows the same group over a period of time, testing them at different times. And then there's a sequential method, which sort of mixes the two. And I'll show you here what it is. Well, in a cross-sectional design, you use people from different age groups and test them all at once. So maybe I want to test some kind of developmental theory. And so I might take a child that's 5, or a group of children that are 5, another group of children that are maybe 7, and then maybe a third group of children that are 9, and then test them on some developmental theory, and then compare them. So you have sort of an age, different age groups that you're testing on. In the longitudinal method, you might just follow one group of children at age 5 and keep testing them until maybe they hit age 9, and then compare them. And then there's a sequential method where you combine both of those things. And here's the visual here. You can see their example uses testing them once, but they're testing 55-year-olds, 60-year-olds, and 65-year-olds, but just once. Then the longitudinals where they follow them. And here is where they sort of combine the two. They're doing it longitudinally, but here they're following 55-year-olds until they get to 65. And at the same time, they are following 65-year-olds until they get to 75. So it's kind of the best of both worlds in a way. For longitudinal methods, I actually did a longitudinal method for the Motorcycle Safety Foundation. And let me tell you, we only followed them for 18 months. It could go up to 2 years or so if participants sort of postponed their appointments with us. But this can take quite a long time. People don't necessarily want to spend that much time with a researcher. It doesn't matter how nice you are. They really don't. It takes a lot of their time and energy to come and play with you, but they don't necessarily want to do that. So oftentimes you'll have a lot of participant drop off. They'll drop out of the study. Yeah, so that makes it harder. For a cross-sectional method, it's much cheaper because you only do it once. You can just take one measurement and you're done, right? Here, inferring differences to developmental change can be challenging, though, with that one measurement, because you have certain possible confounding variables here. Even though you are testing different age groups, you run into what might be called, or what is called, a cohort effect. And that is people at different ages grew up in a different time period. So they had sort of a different experience when they had different music, different movies, different ways of, saying things, and so on. And so their experiences in life can differ vastly. And so if you're trying to test them on some sort of developmental variable, it might be a confounding variable to your research. I just said all that. I get ahead of myself sometimes. And then the problem with longitudinal studies is, so you've been following these people for 20 years and testing them on something, but by the time 20 years is up, now the thing that you were testing is no longer relevant. It's gone and done. So you have to really be careful with these things and be thoughtful about how you do it. And that basically concludes everything. How do I do this? Okay, here we go. That's it. Unless you guys have questions, I'm all done. Have a good weekend.
Thank you. You too.
Thank you, Professor.
Thank you.
Thank you for
you.
hanging out.
Thank you, Professor.
Thanks. Okay.